Hey everyone, welcome to this presentation on logical fallacies. So let's start out with some definitions. The first definition comes from Immanuel Kant's book on logic, written in 1800. It's pretty complex, his definition, at least his wording is, so we'll go through it little by little, but basically here's what he says. Logic is a science of reason, not only as the mere form, but also as to its matter, a science a priori of the necessary laws of thinking, not, however, in respect of particular objects, but as all objects. It is a science, therefore, of the right use of the understanding and of reason as such, not subjectively, that is, not according to empirical psychological principles of how the understanding thinks, but objectively, that is, according to a priori principles of how it ought to think. You'll notice I kind of hesitated on that a priori because I always thought it was pronounced a priori, but everyone that I've checked with on several sources, they all say a priori, which just doesn't feel right to me. So anyway, let's look at the definition piece by piece. The first part, logic is a science of reason not only as to mere form, but also as to matter. So logic's not just the study of the techniques we use when we try to reason with someone. It's more about the nature of reasoning itself. Secondly, a science a priori of the necessary laws of thinking, not, however, in respect to particular objects, but all objects. So what he's saying here is that these are necessary laws. They're not just particular to certain situations, they are universal. We couldn't even think without them. Because imagine if you're trying to argue that logic is somehow not general but particular, you're using logic to argue your case. So you can't even argue that case without logic. Logic is essential for communication of all sorts. It is a science, therefore, of the right use of the understanding and of reason. There is a right use of reason and a wrong use of reason. One's reasoning can be wrong, is what he's saying. Not subjectively, that is, not according to empirical or psychological principles of how the understanding thinks. In other words, the evaluation of reasoning as good or bad is not based on how it makes us feel or how it might affect somebody psychologically. It just is. But objectively, that is, according to a priori principles of how it ought to think. So this is about how we should think. Whether our reasoning is good or bad is an objective determination based on the principles that are self-evident, inherent in the very nature of thinking. Another way we might say this is that logic doesn't care about your feelings. An argument is either logical or it's not, regardless of how others might respond to it. Okay, let's look at another definition, the definition of argument. An argument in critical thinking, in the realm of critical thinking, is any two or more statements in which one is the reason for the other. That comes from our textbook, by the way. Another definition says that defines an argument as efforts to support certain views with reasons. So in this one, notice that the word support. So an argument provides support in the way of rational statements and also by evidence, through evidence. And then we're going to look at a short video clip that kind of put a little humor on the subject. Okay, let's define now what is a logical fallacy. Kemper defines a logical fallacy as a false statement that weakens an argument by distorting an issue, drawing false conclusions, misusing evidence, or misusing language. I think as a general definition that's good, but I think it's a little bit misleading because a conclusion can be false even when its logic is correct, if the premises on which it's based are false. Let me give you an example. Robert is a man. All men can fly. Conclusion, therefore, Robert can fly. Now that is perfectly valid logical argument. However, it's still not sound. It's not a sound argument, because soundness has to do with whether the premises of the argument are true. The second premise on this argument is not true. All men cannot fly. So the conclusion is false, even though the argument is valid. It's rationally logical. It's not committing any logical fallacies. So let's look at a better definition. This one comes from Richard Nordquist. A logical fallacy is an error in reasoning that renders an argument invalid. An argument in which the conclusion doesn't follow logically from what preceded it. So a logical fallacy breaks the a priori laws of good thinking. Now let's look at some specific logical fallacies. Appeal to authority. This is an attempt to prove a conclusion by an improper appeal to an authority. The appeal is considered improper when the authority is either irrelevant or unrecognized. Let's look at an example. Ariana Grande says we should get all the COVID vaccinations, including all the boosters. Now, when I was looking for a popular celebrity who everybody knows, and I have no idea who Ariana Grande is, but I imagine most of you probably do. But the reason this is not a good appeal to authority, because Ariana Grande knows nothing about medicine. So she might get on the television and say these things, but and you might be carried away by simply because she's a celebrity. But she really has no expertise in the area, and that's why this is a fallacy. Some other examples might be, Julia, my assistant at school, says that to get rid of warts, you need to drink a lot of lemon juice. There again, Julia is no authority on the subject. Or how about this? My doctor says that eating oatmeal is good for the heart. Now you might say, aha, that one really is a good use of authority. However, what if I say that the doctor referred to is a dermatologist? She's not a cardiologist. Let's go to the next logical fallacy. Appeal to force. This is any attempt to make someone accept a proposition by using some type of coercion. Now, the coercion doesn't have to be physical. It doesn't have to be violence, but it could be stated in the form of predicting a future dreaded outcome, what we call fear-mongering. Let's look at an example. Potential faculty hire. Why does the university not include creationism as a possible alternative to the interpretation of the data? Department head, I am sensing you might not be the right person for this position. So with that statement of the department head, he's kind of using coercion to say to that person, hey, if you don't straighten up and get rid of this creationism idea, we're not going to hire you. Appeal to pity. This is a strong emotional appeal meant to subvert someone's rational thinking. Let's look again at an example. This comes from Nancy Pelosi, and I don't remember exactly when it was about a year ago. She says, as you've heard me say when people ask me, what are the 3 most important issues facing Congress? I always say the same thing, our children, our children, our children. Everything we do is about the children. She said this in a speech before the House floor, where the Democrats were intending to move forward a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. Number 4, appeal to tradition. This is citing the historical preferences and practices of a culture or even of a particular person as evidence for a proposition or argument being correct. Let's look again at an example. Reporter, Mr. Hatfield, why are you still fighting the McCoys? Hatfield, well, you see, young man, my father feuded with the McCoys, and his father feuded with them, and so did my great-grandfather. There is a caveat with this fallacy. While tradition may be a fallacy in a deductive argument, it's not so in an inductive argument. In other words, an inductive argument is where you join together a series of facts as evidence to the probability of a conclusion. A deductive argument leads to a necessary conclusion as long as your arguments are valid. An inductive argument leads to probability. You're simply looking at the evidence and you're saying, based on the evidence, the preponderance of evidence, this is probably the conclusion. And in that case, history and tradition should be included as part of our evidence. We can see this in a quote from C.K. Chesterton. He wrote, "Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about." Let's go to the next fallacy, which is appeal to novelty. This is the opposite of the appeal to tradition, in that it is the attempt to claim that the newness or modernity of something is evidence of its truth. Here's an example. Student, why should we all change our definition of marriage? Professor, because a new and better morality is sweeping the nation. No longer are people with alternative lifestyles ashamed. No longer are people caught up in the outmoded moralities of the past. The professor here is using an appeal to novelty as an argument, when in reality that's a fallacy. Number 6, burden of proof. This is based on the principle that the one who is making an accusation or a claim is responsible for providing sufficient evidence to support that claim. The burden of proof fallacy happens when that person tries to shift the burden of proof on the opponent. Recognition that this is a fallacy is behind the fact that we have in our legal system the right to remain silent, by the way. Here's an example. Simply because you do not have evidence that something exists does not mean that you have evidence that it doesn't exist. That was an argument used by Donald Rumsfeld in defense of the U.S.'s use of force in Iraq because they argued that they had weapons of mass destruction. And there was no evidence for the weapons of mass destruction. So Rumsfeld basically turns it around and puts the onus on the public to come up with evidence that they don't exist, which is the perfect example of the burden of proof fallacy. Number 7, appeal to popularity. This is the use of popularity as evidence that something must be true, the use of celebrities and so forth. Most Americans believe UFO sightings are evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life. Therefore, it must be true. There you have an example of an appeal to the popularity of an idea as evidence of its factuality, when there may not actually be evidence. 8, sweeping generalization. This is an attempt to apply a general rule to a specific situation and disregard any relevant exceptions to the rule. Here we have an example from the Bible. Jesus said we must turn the other cheek, so the use of violence to arrest and incarcerate people is morally wrong. Well, in this example, you're taking one specific verse and one specific statement and in a specific situation and applying it in a broad, sweeping way. The fact is that Jesus was talking about an insult. Somebody slapping them on the cheek is not the type of attack that is threatening to your life. And so to use that as an example of the use of violence in other situations in every case is a sweeping generalization, and it is a logical fallacy. Number 9, the fallacy of composition. This assumes that when a property applies to individual members of a class, it must also apply to the whole class. There's an example. Athletes in the NHL are paid a lot of money. Therefore, the NHL must be a wealthy organization. Well, not necessarily so, because there are a lot of other factors that go into it. Another example that I thought of just today in writing my book is the church. You could say, somebody might think, well, a lot of the members of that church know a lot about the Bible. Therefore, that church must know a lot about the Bible. Not necessarily true. Number 10, the fallacy of division. This assumes that when a property applies to the class, it must also apply to every member of the class. It's the opposite of the fallacy of composition. This is where you start with the class and you say, well, the classification has this characteristic, therefore all the members of that classification must also. Here's an example. Catholic doctrine states that the Pope is infallible, so all Catholics believe the Pope is infallible. And we could apply that to any church group or denomination. Number 11, the red herring. This is introducing an irrelevant issue into an argument, thus derailing the original discussion and causing the argument to contain two unrelated issues. So you're confusing the issue by introducing another issue that is unrelated. Here's an example. Kyle Rittenhouse is the teenager who was attacked by rioters in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Using a rifle to defend himself, he killed 2 people and shot another. Later, he was accused of murder. One of the prosecution's argument was that Rittenhouse had illegally carried his gun across state lines. Anyway, whether it was true or not, it's not related to whether he committed a murder or not. And so this is a great example of a lawyer introducing a red herring into the argument. The straw man, distorting an opposing position into an extreme version of itself and then arguing against the extreme version. So it makes your position look better. You exaggerate the other person's position, so that makes yours look stronger. Some people are opposed to sending military to the Ukraine. They think it's okay for Russia to illegally invade a sovereign nation. Well, you may have problems with invading Ukraine for other reasons. You may not consider it the most important thing we should be focusing on right now, or that there are other urgent needs to spend that money on. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you agree that what Russia did was okay. So that's a straw man argument. Number 13, abusing the man. This is any attempt to disprove a proposition or argument by launching a personal attack on its author. Here's an example. I believe parents have a right to determine what their children should be subjected to in school. The opposing person says, that just shows you're a racist, misogynist, homophobic bigot. False cause. This is jumping to a conclusion based upon coincidence rather than on sufficient testing, repeated occurrence, or evidence. This fallacy is based on the fact that correspondence does not mean causation. Here's an example. I woke up with a stomach ache this morning. It's the beans I ate yesterday. Well, it might have been the beans, or it might have been some other reason. So you don't know just that because there is a correlation that it actually means causation. 15, non sequitur. This is kind of an all-encompassing one. It just means that the premises have no logical connection or relevance to the conclusion. It just means that it doesn't make sense. And that's what the Latin non sequitur means, literally, does not follow. So it refers to the deductive logic in which the conclusion should flow necessarily from the premises, and when it doesn't, it's a non sequitur. Here's an example from a movie I understand. I got this text from a transcript from a movie. I don't even remember what the movie is. It might even be called Mr. and Mrs. Smith or something like that. And in one scene, Mrs. Smith says, "It's 9 o'clock. We have eaten the fish and chips and the English salad. That's because we live in the suburbs of London and our name is Smith." Seeing that her reasoning was so illogical, it made no sense, he responded in the same way. And without looking up from his newspaper, he says, "I love potatoes, especially when they are fried in fat," as if that had any connection with the conversation. So they're both speaking in non sequitur language. Number 16, the undistributed middle. Of all the logical fallacies, this is, I can remember when I was first trying to understand this, and it's the most difficult, at least for me, to wrap my brain around. But it's a formal fallacy that occurs in a categorical syllogism. A syllogism is where you have two or more arguments that lead to a conclusion. This is a formal fallacy that occurs in a categorical syllogism when the middle term is not distributed, at least in one premise. So you're looking at categories, and one of the terms of the categories is not distributed in at least one of the premise. When they say distributed, that means we're not saying that all of this category has these characteristics. So there's the middle term is not distributed. Let's look at an example. All horses have 4 legs. All dogs have 4 legs. Therefore, all horses are dogs. It sounds logical, but then you obviously know it's not logical. But can we explain why it's not logical? Well, it's because one of the components of the first premise is not distributed. In other words, and that component is creatures with 4 legs. At no point does it say all creatures with 4 legs are X or this or that. And that's why it's undistributed. So that's why it's false. All Seventh-day Adventists believe in a literal new earth. John believes in a literal new earth. Therefore, John is a Seventh-day Adventist. Well, that's a fallacy because it says nothing about all those who believe in a literal new earth. At no point does it say anything about that includes all those who believe in a literal new earth. So its middle term is undistributed. 17, naturalistic fallacy. This is when a person bases their argument on the notion that what is natural is better or what ought to be. In other words, the foundation for the argument or position is a value judgment, and the fallacy happens when the argument shifts from a statement of fact to one of value. So let's look at an example. Marijuana is not harmful because it's a plant that grows naturally. You probably hear that a lot, and you're going to be hearing that more and more states legalize marijuana. And whether or not you believe that marijuana should be legal, this is not a good argument. It's a fallacy, just basing it on the fact that it's natural. 18, the loaded question. This is asking a question that contains a subtle accusation. Here's the well-known example. Have you stopped beating your wife? And you'll notice that contained within the question is the assumption that you were beating your wife at one point. So this is a loaded question. We could add to that maybe, do you believe that climate change, which all the scientists agree is destroying our planet, is not real? Number 19, amphibole. This is a fallacy of ambiguity, where the ambiguity in question arises directly from the sentence's grammatical structure. It's poor grammatical structure. And you get a lot of silly ones with this one. A reckless motorist Thursday struck and injured a student who was jogging through the campus in his pickup truck. Therefore, it is unsafe to jog in your pickup truck. I can't think right now offhand of any more realistic arguments that use amphibole, but that's an example. Number 20, equivocation. Similar to amphibole, but in this case, it's a fallacy that occurs when one uses an ambiguous word or term or phrase in more than one sense. And this renders the argument misleading. Here's an example. The brolga is an Australian bird that belongs to the family of cranes. That's why it's good at lifting heavy things. Number 21, begging the question. This is attempting to prove something by assuming the very thing you are trying to prove. Here's an example. Women should have the right to abortion because women have a right to do whatever they want with their bodies. Well, if they have the right to do whatever they want with their bodies, obviously they have a right to abortion. So you're assuming the conclusion. And that's a fallacy. Number 22, the false dilemma. This is a fallacy that happens when only 2 choices are offered in an argument or proposition, when in fact a greater number of possible choices exist between the 2 extremes. It's also called a false choice or a fake debate. Stop thinking about it so much and just believe. And you hear that a lot among evangelicals sometimes, and that is the rejection of rationality and the preference for feelings, or we could say spiritual mysticism, when in fact the belief and facts or rationality are not mutually exclusive. You can have both. 23, hasty generalization. This is when a conclusion is drawn about a group based on a sample that's too small to properly represent the group. Here's an example. For our focus group on Gen Z perspectives, we had 6 participants, all of whom believed government should provide a guaranteed minimum wage to all its citizens. Gen Zers believe socialism is the answer to Americans' problems. So, for one thing, that's wrong. There's a couple things wrong with this argument. And one is hasty generalization because 6 people are not enough. I have heard the number 25, that if you want a sampling that's has some legitimacy, you need at least 25 participants, and they need to be selected randomly also. But there's another aspect to this that's problematic, and that is to associate automatically the belief that everyone should have a guaranteed minimum wage with socialism, and I'm not so sure that those two things are the same. Number 24, weak analogy. Attempting to prove or disprove an argument or position by using an analogy that's too dissimilar to be effective. Let's look at an example. Not believing in UFOs is like not believing we breathe air. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We might think that's a cute little analogy, but as far as being able to prove a point with that, it's not good. It's because the two things being compared are not similar enough. We have lots of evidence and scientific evidence about what it means to breathe air and what air is, but can you really compare that with the evidence that UFOs exist? I mean, UFOs as understood as visitors from other planets. Number 25, the middle ground. And I really think this one's an important one to pay attention to because I think it's really prevalent today. This is arguing that the truth can always be found in the middle, at some point between two extremes. There's an example. Holly said vaccinations cause autism in children, but her friend Caleb, who's a medical doctor, says this theory has been debunked. So the truth must be that vaccinations cause autism in some children, but not in all. Well, not necessarily so. You can see that the doctor obviously has more authority than Holly, who's simply your friend. The doctor has training in medicine, and I would give him a little more authority on that. Okay, there we have it. So I'm going to make this available online on Populi, and I think it would be a good idea for all of us to have this list before our eyes at some place where you can grab it easily to check your own arguments or to evaluate the arguments of others. And we need to learn them because they are very useful. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.